Today we're going to be discussing what is called the Age of Liberalism. This would stretch largely from about 1850 through to about the early 1900s. Now, although this is a period where liberalism is certainly booming, and more, again, we're talking here in terms of the idea of liberties, not 21st century concepts of liberalism, Democrat versions of liberalism. What we're talking about here really is this idea that in the 19th century and in the 18th century, and then certainly spreading onwards, you have this idea that individual people should be given liberties in respect to their government. So there should be things that we still sort of hold as basic understandings today. There should be ideas of freedom of the press. There should be ideas of freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, access to voting, no property requirements for voting, ability for people to own property. Those are sort of the liberal ideas that we're talking about here, that are emerging in the 19th century and are certainly evolving here. What you're also going to see, though, in this period is that there are some bucking of the systems. So we're going to talk about three locations. First, we're going to talk about Britain and how Britain is expanding its access to voting and its liberal ideas. We're going to talk about Tsarist Russia, which is sort of one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back. And then we're going to talk about France. And France is just really a very big hot mess during this period. So for the British society in the 19th century is what many of us would call sort of the Victorian consensus. So many of you, I'm sure, have been, and the sort of popularity of Queen Victoria over the last couple of years or so, whether that's through the series, the movies that have come out, the Jane Austen novels, right? The Victorian period is becoming a period that many people are acquainted with. And during this period, there's a lot of change going on in Britain. Unlike a lot of other parts of Europe, Britain has had the Industrial Revolution for about 100 years by the mid-1800s, give or take a little bit. And what that means is that Britain's social classes are changing a lot more quickly and a lot more drastically than other parts of Europe. And as a result, there is better quality of life for a lot of people. There's growing education because people need education in order to have these jobs during the Industrial Revolution. So there is a growing feeling of acceptance to the circumstances that people are having. And one of the words that I don't have here, or phrases, is this idea of nouveau riche. And maybe I'll add that actually while we're talking here. And this is this idea, it's a French phrase that means literally new rich, the new wealthy class. And this is this new group of people who are making their money through the Industrial Revolution. They might be railroad magnates. They might be people who have sort of middle class jobs, but can buy themselves a nice house and sort of buy themselves the nice clothes. And we call this idea middle class values. They are taking on new religiosity. And such. There's this idea of social mobility. You may start as a lower class person in the shops, but you are able to sort of work your way up to become, the shop manager or ultimately the overseer of a territory. It's a period of massive change. This all really changes and becomes, if Britain becomes more democratic, in 1867. Now, throughout the 1800s, Britain had become incrementally more democratic. So in 1832, there was a reform bill that was passed that opened up voting to people who are over the men who are over the age of 21, and it reduced the. It also changed the boroughs. So this basically, if you think of it as counties, right, the representation of counties, right? Some counties had smaller populations, some counties had larger populations, and it moved people into one area, and it opens up the places that people can vote, giving more votes to people who live in certain regions versus others. In 18, and then there's also this movement of Chartism, which again, so you might have heard of the British People's Charter. It's certainly it's in your textbook for those who have had a chance to read it yet. And the British People's Charter is a petition that asks for greater representation within the government, but also better treatment of people. So these two movements are sort of pushing for the common people to get more rights. In 1867, a reform bill is passed, and it reduces the land ownership, but also allows for rent management, to be considered as part of your voting requirements. So that as long as you own 10 pounds of property or you pay 10 pounds in rent, you are eligible to vote, excuse me. Now, unfortunately, again, this is not totally a sort of a path towards liberalism, but women are still not permitted the right to vote. Again, it's not going to be until 1919 that women in Britain will be allowed to vote. For those of you who know, it will not be until 1920 when women will get the right to vote here in the United States. But what is important to see is that this doubles the number of voters in Britain, or at least in England and Wales, to 2 million people. So this really opens up the voting population within England. Although there's a lot of movement of good liberalism and giving people rights and nationalism, there is not a whole representation of this. And Ireland is certainly part of that. So Ireland had been absorbed. So throughout the 1600s and 1700s, Ireland had become more and more a part of the British Empire, English Empire turned British Empire. And that happens in the 1500s. It's through what are called the Ulster Plantations, where Queen Elizabeth basically encourages British landowners to send over representatives and to take over more and more land in Ireland. And then in the 1600s, small changes again. Oliver Cromwell takes over more and more land. And then in the 1700s, more and more land is taken over by British magnates through purchasing and other ways. And then in 1800, this sort of becomes official, and the Act of Union of 1800 brings together the United Kingdom and inserts Ireland. Now, there is a nationalist movement that stretches back all the way to the 1600s, where people want English people out of Ireland. And this has really picked up even more in the 1800s. Ireland, Southern Ireland, but there's also Northern Irish who are Catholic, who want to see a Catholic country, and Britain, England, Scotland are very largely Protestant countries, and because of that, the Irish are very much disgruntled with the English leadership. They also feel that they are oppressed. Catholics in England are not given a lot of rights. They are not allowed to vote. They are not allowed to own land in some places. And this, there's a movement towards Catholic emancipation, but it's sort of unpopular in the 1700s. It does ultimately come around. The sort of big thing that happened in the 1800s is the potato famine. From 1845 until 1849, there are a series of potato blights where harvests are completely destroyed by the potato famine. And the potato had become a major crop for the people of Ireland. And this is not really the place for me to sort of talk too much about the potato famine. But it is important to know that the country loses about half its population, from about 4 million to about 2 million. 1 million, it is reckoned through death, 1 million through immigration to Canada, the United States, particularly to New York, but then also into the continent, to Scandinavia, and certainly into other parts of Europe as well. William Gladstone, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the end of the 19th century, pushes forward um, a bill in 1886 that tries to get Ireland its home rule. However, it's not successful, and it splits apart Gladstone's Liberal government, and ultimately it fails in the late 1800s. The next big event that we're going to talk about here is called the Crimean War. So the Crimean Peninsula is a small peninsula that juts out of southern Russia, and it's an important location for trade, but it's also an important location for the Russians, right? It's a warm water port. It sticks into the Caspian Sea, and we give Russia the ability to trade in this warm water port, which they might not otherwise have. However, it is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. So there is a war that breaks out in 1853 between Russia and the British, French, and Ottoman empires, who are fighting to control the Crimean Peninsula. The war is important because it pits, this industrial Britain, this industrial France, and this not industrial Ottoman Empire against the Russian Empire. Now, Russia had sort of slowly, incrementally, not really, industrialized. And what happens as a result is you have a real bad defeat for Russia. And in the Paris Treaty of 1856, a lot of rights are given to the Balkans. The Ottomans are giving back Crimea. And it's really, in a lot of ways, a really big embarrassment for Russia. They lose land, they lose face, and as a result, there is, the Russian people start to revolt against the Tsar. Now, the Russian Tsars is a position, you might think of this as emperor, is a position that stretches back to the 1600s. And it's organized around the Tsar, who again is the emperor, but then surrounding him is families of oligarchs and noblemen who are significant in that they are landowners and they are the people who give the Tsar power. Now, there are a group of people in Russia, and something to the effect of 90% of people in Russia are what are called serfs. Serfs are poor laborers and they are poor farmers. And they finally receive their independence in 1861. They are sort of allowed to move off the land. So serfdom, and I should say that Russia is the last European country to abolish serfdom. Now, serfs were tied to the land, meaning that they were forced to keep on the land and sort of pay rents to the landlords constantly. And it was a way for them to be controlled and not be given any rights. Alexander II, who was the Tsar, begins what are called dumas. Dumas were councils. You might want to think of them as sort of local government. So here in New York, right, we would think of them as sort of like our city council or something to the effect of that. I'm sort of speeding through here, but what I want to show you is the real sort of trouble the Tsars are getting in. This again, the Tsars are keeping their absolute power. They're keeping they're keeping sort of strict control, but they're sort of giving small changes to people to sort of give rights. But Russia is really having a real hard time in the 1900s, and that is also exhibited in the Russo-Japanese War. So the Russo-Japanese War happens between, as the name would suggest, between Russia and Japan. And it's partly because both Russia and Japan desire a portion of northern China called Manchuria, and then the Korean Peninsula. They want it for a lot of reasons: trade reasons, access to the sea, resources. What really the important piece here is that Japan is far more industrialized, far more militaristic than the Russian Empire was, so that when the war breaks out, it ends, as you can see, very quickly. It ends in about 11 months, and Russia loses. This is the second time in 50 years that Russia has been defeated by another source of industrialized countries. And this, again, is a huge blow to the Russian ego. I should also point out here that President Teddy Roosevelt is the first U.S. president to win a Nobel Peace Prize because he helps negotiate the treaty between Russia and Japan. There's not really a ton of that's significant here, other than that, to know that, again, this is a big loss for the Russians. This helps to inspire the Russian Revolution in 1905. This is not the more famous revolution that takes place in 1917, but this is an important, or starts in 1917. This is an important revolution because it, again, is a chance for Russia to try and change their actions to make their government more responsive to the people. So 100,000 Russian workers strike in St. Petersburg in January of 1905. They want better justice. They want justice. They want better work conditions. They want representation in governments. They're embarrassed by the loss of the Russo-Japanese War. And government troops are sent in to put this down. Now, at first, they want to sort of break up this protest. One thing comes to another, and ultimately there's an event called Bloody Sunday where 300 people are killed, thousands are injured when Russian soldiers fire on this crowd of people. In order to suppress, or at least placate, the people and basically keep his job, the new Tsar, Nicholas II, issues what is called the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto begins what is called the Duma. So we had Dumas. These are Duma. This is the Duma, excuse me. This is a elected deliberative assembly, sort of like a parliament, that is voted in by a universal male suffrage. It also allows freedom of the press. Freedom of religion is still not a real thing yet. People are still being discriminated for being all sorts of religions. Basically, if you were not Russian Orthodox, if you were Catholic, if you were Jewish, if you were Muslim, you were still being discriminated against. But if you were Russian Orthodox, you were not. This ultimately leads, and you can see this as being a sort of small step to the beginning of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the reason for that is that these are sort of unfulfilled promises. People in Russia believed that this would be the sort of solution to a lot of their problems. And obviously, it just was not going to be. So let's then turn our attention very briefly then to France. France in the mid-1800s is just a mess, right? There's, if you sort of think back to the French Revolution a couple of weeks ago, right, we talked about the French Revolution, the institutioning of that first republic in the 1790s, and then Napoleon comes to power, and we have a French Empire in the late 1790s. You have the French Empire then through till 1848. There's a small revolution. We bring back the Republic, so now we are into the Second French Republic that lasts for 3 years. And then in 1851, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Louis Napoleon, becomes the emperor in 1851. So now we are back to the Second French Empire, which again, this is just super confusing and really just a mess. So from 1851 onward until the 1870s, you have a French empire. The person in charge, again, is Louis Napoleon. He calls himself Napoleon III. Who was Napoleon II? That would have been Napoleon's brother. However, he doesn't become emperor. Now, people generally support him. There's a strong conservative idea in France that supports the monarchy, that supports the sort of church, the institutionalized church. And during this period, generally, people are fairly happy. And the reason that people are happy is because business is booming. People are very happy because the economy in France is doing well. French exports are doubling during this period. French prosperity and French success is doubling during this period. And one of the things that they're really great at exporting is their money. The French are backing up a lot of different places around Europe with their cash. So you have banks starting, particularly the Rothschilds, who you might know as a famous European banking family. And they're investing in companies. They're investing particularly in railroads all over Europe. French railroads in Russia sort of crisscross the country. And again, it is all through this investment. Now, France is becoming more liberal. However, there are sort of these old institutional problems that France is experiencing. And one such thing that they're experiencing is a resurgence in anti-Semitism. And that is really highlighted here by the Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, a guy named Alfred Dreyfus is a military officer who was working in Paris. And Dreyfus is a Jewish man who, again, is working for the government, working for the army. Now, there's a scandal that breaks out where French army secrets are being passed to the German government, and this is being discovered in a waste paper basket, and there is circumstantial evidence that attaches Alfred Dreyfus to this event. There is a claim that his handwriting matches that of the person who is sending the messages. Now, that obviously is a very weak connection, and it obviously doesn't prove anything. And in 2020 or the 21st century, this would obviously not even be considered real evidence. Dreyfus is found to be blamed. He's put on trial. He's court-martialed, and he is exiled to Devil Island, which is a small island off the coast of France. Now, this is done very swiftly, no real due process, and as you might suspect, secrets are still being leaked. Dreyfus is proven innocent, right? Because he's in exile, but secrets are still getting out. So we obviously know it's not him sending away the messages. Now, no investigation is ever done to really prove his innocence. And ultimately, for the next 5 or so years, he's in prison for a lot of it. He's sort of out of prison for a bit. And ultimately, in 1899, he receives a presidential pardon, and he dies 30 years later, sort of in his own freedom, though. But it's important to see that for 5 years, this man's life was ruined by, faulty legal apparatus, and by sort of rampant discrimination against this man, right? They never really gave him his fair trial because of blinding anti-Semitism. It must be he who is submitting these secrets to the German government. What I'm trying to show you here is that in the 1800s, there are great movements towards liberalism. In Britain, you have the reform bills. in Russia, you have the passing of the emancipation of the serfs. In France, you have this sort of flip flopping between the empire and the republic. And you have, at the same time, these really tough breaks for liberalism, right? Ireland is not given its independence, not given its home rule, and people die in huge numbers because of a famine. In Russia, you have this sort of holding on of absolute power by the Russian government, even at the same time that people are trying to fight against that. And in France, you have raging anti-Semitism and discrimination towards people. So I hope you see the sort of troubles of the mid 19th century.